Hi, everybody. Bill De La Cruz here with the Origination Point Podcast. It's been a while since I've recorded anything, and I have to say some of it is because it's been really hard to know what to say and how to respond to this crazy country that we're all living in. And I'm not going to get too much into that other than I'm going to connect some of what I'm going to talk about today to what's happening in our country. And you all can think about whether it makes sense or whether it is something that you believe we can do something about. Because I'm still hopeful. I still believe that we can shift what we're all experiencing right now. And it's going to take a lot of work because we're all going to have to take some ownership in how we move forward. So, what I want to talk today are I want to talk about blind spots, and I want to talk about how they're created, the impact they have, and even get into some of the divisiveness in our country and what we're seeing. And so, if you're not aware, blind spots are just that. They're parts of our humanity that everybody has them. And the reason they're called blind spots is we may not be aware that we have them. And when they show up, we may not even be conscious that they're playing a role unless we're around somebody who says, you might have a blind spot because I just heard you say something or do something. And are you aware of what just went on? So let's talk a little bit about how blind spots are created. So they form before we have language. Blind spots are formed when we're very, very young. They're shaped by our family, our culture, trauma, reward, punishment, silence, and modeling. And I'll just use myself as the example. Most of my blind spots were created when I was young and growing up in a home where my dad was angry. Verbal and physical abuse was part of what myself and my sister, who was 8 years older than me, experienced. Trauma, it was constantly reward, punishment type of thing. And then just being cut off from having dialogue, especially if we didn't admit to something that we thought we did, which is very interesting because in our country today, we're being told that things are a certain way, even beyond what we see or what we experience. And that's really how I grew up, is having these experiences and then being told, oh no, what you're experiencing isn't real. That didn't really happen. I didn't really say that. And it created these unconscious blind spots, things I was not even aware of. And it's usually something that at some point served us. So sometimes our blind spots serve us. So if it protects us from rejection or danger or emotional pain. So my blind spot of thinking that I wasn't reacting to what people thought of me was saving me from the emotional pain of the true recognition that I was a jerk, that I was raised by a father who put me in a very combative situation at 8, 9 years old, to where I had to fight for my life, essentially, and fight for being wrong until I was just beat into submission, to where it was easier to just say, all right, I did it, even when I didn't do it. And so that blind spot of not recognizing who I was or the harm I was causing served me, because it saved me from feeling all that emotional pain, trauma, hurt, even the punishment that I got at a very young age. And it protected me even from feeling rejected. And it's a really weird dichotomy because if I rejected other people, then I didn't feel rejected. So how twisted is that? And that's really how I lived for a while, is that I could be in a relationship with somebody and not trust them. And my blind spot was rejection. So let me reject you before you reject me. And I rationalized that it was okay to do that because it's better for them to experience than for me to have to go back and dredge up all of those old wounds that I was trying to protect. And then they're reinforced. I didn't choose to have that blind spot. I just absorbed it. I absorbed it from what I saw, what we were praised for, what I was never allowed to question. And for you, it's probably the same thing, thinking about what did you see growing up and how did you take it in and make it a part of your humanity? What were you praised for? I really wasn't praised for a whole lot that I can remember, other than I played music. I played the saxophone from third grade to high school, and I was really good at that. And I did get praised for being a good musician. So I won't say I never got praise. I wasn't great in school or sports. I was really good at music. And so that praise, I don't know, it's kind of interesting because I haven't really thought about how did that play out in my life and how did that become a blind spot. I'm imagining it became a blind spot because I was looking for people to recognize me. I was looking for people to see that I was capable, that I was smart, that I could do this. And so maybe I went out of my way to step on others so that I could be the one recognized, even though when you're playing music, it's a group effort. And I can imagine that I did that in other areas of my life growing up where I wanted to be seen. I wanted to take credit. And if I didn't get credit, then I felt less than. And as far as this idea of voice, that's also really interesting because I didn't really have a voice. And the only time I was asked about what I felt was when I was being accused of doing something. And the question was, well, did you do it? Yes or no? And if I said no, then I would get yelled at or I would get hit until I said yes. Okay, I did it. And so it's literally being forced into submission to where it was easier for me to just admit wrong, even though I knew that I wasn't the person who did that in our house. And that showed up as a huge blind spot because then I would find fault in others or I would accuse others of doing things and want them to take responsibility for something, especially if it didn't go well. If it went well, then of course, it was all me. I was the one who should get credit for that. And I grew up with all of these limiting blind spots because I had no self-awareness. I did not even know they were happening, probably until my late 20s or early 30s is when I started to recognize that I had some issues with how I treated people. And I think some of the indicators of a blind spot are when people check us on our behavior, we want to justify, defend, or in some way make them wrong for calling us out. And for me, what I recognize now is that's an indicator that I'm probably, what I'm being accused of is probably true. And it may be a blind spot. And now I'm much more open to that. When I got accused of doing something very young, I would go to defend, justify, or even use that submission piece and just drive them away Because if they weren't in my space, then I wouldn't have to listen to how I impacted them. And so as I grew up and started to recognize that blind spots are real, it's not that we have them that's the issue. It's that we defend them as truth. That's the problem. And I defended my blind spots as if they were true. I'm right, you're wrong. You need to be submissive so I don't have to be. Those were a couple of the big ones. And I didn't choose those. We don't choose our blind spots. We do choose whether we're willing to look at them. And so, what I'm going to ask all of you listening to do is to think about, what are your blind spots? Where are you finding yourself defending, justify, or in some way making another person wrong when they bring something up to you about how they experienced you, which is another approach to personal growth. Because before I was aware of my blind spots, when somebody would tell me something about how I impacted them, my first question was, well, what's wrong with you? Because obviously it's your problem, because there's nothing wrong with me, because I wasn't willing to own my blind spots and I was unconscious. So I didn't want to be self-aware. So being unconscious was another way that I could act like I didn't know this was actually happening. And so as I became more aware and as I started to own my blind spots, I shifted from what's wrong with you to tell me how you experienced me. Because that's a different conversation, and that's a deeper conversation that I had to really work hard to get to, because it means that what I'm asking you to do is to tell me the real life experience that you just had with me. How did I treat you? How did I talk to you? What was my emotional energy like? And if I sit in a space of justifying, defending, or making you wrong, that conversation will not be at all productive. It'll be horrible, and it'll just impact our relationships. So let's talk a little bit about the impact of our relationships. So blind spots turn curiosity into certainty. So what does that mean? It means that when two people interact, we can interact in a variety of ways. Being curious to me is more just about asking questions, about sharing about ourselves. I may have a blind spot of feeling like I wasn't valued. So maybe the interaction that you have with me is just all about me. And I never ask you one question about you and how you experience life. And this idea of certainty is, we think that the way that we see the world through our blind spot is the way that the world is, or the way that that person is. And so when we think we already know, then we stop listening. And we for sure stop being curious. So we stop asking questions. And so the idea of curiosity is that everyone you meet is a new person. And even if you meet the same person on different days, they're going to show up differently based on what they're experiencing that day. So it's almost like a brand new interaction, even if you know that person. And so how do you shift from certainty to curiosity, and to be curious about the other person, not only about asking them questions about, how are you today? What's new? What's something that's challenging for you? What's something that you're really successful at? What's something that you want to learn? Versus being declarative and telling that person something. So when we're declarative versus inquisitive, we're sharing our perspective. When we're curious, we're asking for their perspective. And so the idea of this is to be aware of, how are you stepping in to an interaction? Because I know, and I've worked with people, and I know that I have done this, where I knew I was going to interact with somebody, and the last interaction I had with them didn't go well for this reason, this reason, this reason. So in my head, I'm already thinking about, oh, here's who I'm interacting with. They're a jerk, or they're stupid, or they're arrogant. And I put all these labels on them, which are actually my blind spot labels. Anyway, I put them onto the other person, and then I go, this is going to be a really bad conversation. I already know it going into it. So I'm going to go in there with the certainty that that's how it's going to be, and I'm going to act that way. And I will realize exactly what it is that I'm bringing into the conversation. Not because it's real, more because it's what I'm creating based on what I'm going into that interaction with. And that's a deeper level concept about how our mindset impacts how we interact with each other. So whatever I bring in up here is going to be manifested out here. So if I have a preconceived idea and I'm certain that this is who that person is, chances are I'm going to see that. And so when we know and stop listening, then the way that our blind spots show up and how they impact our relationships is judgment, defensiveness, withdrawal, or righteousness. And all four of those are detrimental to really engaging, because I'm going to judge you. I'm going to be defensive towards you. Oh, no, that's not true. Oh, no, that's not what I did. Oh, you took it out of context. How many times are we hearing that in our country today? People saying, no, you're just taking it out of context. Or being righteous, meaning that I'm right. What you see before your eyes isn't real. The way that I'm going to spin it, that's what's real. And if you don't believe me, then there's something wrong with you. That's happening in our country today in a whole variety of ways at all levels of this country that we're now living in. And I'll bring that in and out of this because I think that that's impacting these blind spots and this judgmentalness and this defensiveness and withdrawing and being self-righteous. Those are impacting our country, our communities, our organizations, our friendships. And most relational conflict's not about what happened. It's about the story we tell ourselves about what it means, because we're operating in a blind spot. It means we're creating all these false narratives about what's going on, which is, again, that's what's happening in our country. So what we're seeing in our country is blind spots on steroids, where the relational conflict is happening, and it's always happening. Only now everybody's spinning a different story about what it means versus just looking at, what did I see before my eyes? If I take all the judgment out of it, what does this picture tell me? And I think that's the biggest challenge, because if we take our judgment out of it, then we have to be willing to accept what is versus what we want to make up to be, which are two different things. Believe me, I did craft some really amazing stories about what was happening in my life. And the majority of my stories were wrong, because in my stories, I was always the hero or the victim, and the other person was always the perpetrator or the villain. And so we have to get out of our heads and stop telling ourselves these stories. They're what I call false narratives. So look at the news any given day. Go on the internet and you'll see people giving false narratives about people, about what we're seeing. And when two people are protecting blind spots at the same time, connection is pretty much impossible. And that's why we're seeing such a disconnect in our communities, in our organizations, in our country, is because people are protecting their blind spots. And they're basically going into these stories as if they're true and saying, ignore what you're seeing, even though what we're seeing is being videotaped from 10 different angles, because everybody has a video camera now and is videotaping everything. And yet we're being told to believe something else. or someone's creating this false narrative about another person. And then the ability to connect is just non-existent. And so most conflict is not two people disagreeing, it's two nervous systems trying to stay safe. So it's basically us and our emotional beings saying, I need to create a safe environment. So I'm going to create this whole story about what's happening so that I can have some level of comfortability. And at the same time, the other person's doing the same thing. And so it ends up doing this. There's no way that there's going to be any kind of a connection because it creates too much friction. So blind spots and division in this country. Division is fueled by unexamined stories. Story about who's right, who's dangerous, who belongs, and who does not. And we are being given all of these narratives about those things all the time in this country, about who's right, who's wrong, who belongs, who doesn't belong. And these blind spots allow us to dehumanize without even realize we're doing it. Or maybe we can realize we're doing it and not care. Because some of the people that I've seen who are leaders in this country on all sides of the aisle, so believe me, for me, this isn't just about a certain group. I see it on the whole spectrum of our culture and system. People are being dehumanized. And I would say in some cases, people aren't aware of it. And yet in other cases, people are completely aware of it and don't care. Because it's easier to dehumanize somebody than it is to take responsibility for something. And so when we don't examine our own fears, we project those onto others. And that's what you're seeing in this dehumanization is you're actually seeing somebody else's fears and biases that are being put on another person. Like saying a mother of children who was killed protesting is a radical, or a nurse who was shot is a radical. That's a narrative that is being projected onto others through some fear that that person who's doing the projecting has. And you can see where it's heading us. It's heading us in some very dangerous directions. Because healing doesn't begin with changing someone else's mind. It begins with understanding what we are protecting inside ourselves. And I don't know if some of those people who are creating all these false narratives are even willing to talk about what they're protecting inside of themselves. And I'll leave you with this to think about. And then I'm going to come back on my next episode and talk about how we can use tools to create awareness and healing. You cannot build a bridge while defending a wall. And I think it's time for us to think about, all of us to think about, because in some ways we're all complicit in where we are. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a victim of all of these leaders. I'm saying, how am I complicit? And what am I going to do to build a bridge and at the same time not defend my own walls and not defend my own blind spots? If this content is interesting to you, or if you have a question, please follow up. I encourage you to ask questions, to share your thoughts with me. delacruzleadershipsolutions.com is my website. There's a contact link there. I would love to hear from you. I will put your questions on our podcast and we'll talk about them. Whether you agree with me or not, your perspective is valid. And that's another piece that we need to get to, is realizing that because I don't agree with your perspective doesn't mean there's not some validity to it. What I would ask you, though, is to be open to a conversation and to hear a perspective that may be different from your own. What I'll leave you with again is that quote, you cannot build a bridge while defending a wall. And if you're really serious about deconstructing your blind spots, the first piece is awareness. So just start to become aware of when you become judgmental, defensive, or arrogantly want to make the other person wrong, because chances are you're defending a blind spot. I appreciate you listening, and share this content if it resonates with you. Start a conversation with somebody.